When wars end, the men involved in the fighting are usually eager to return home to their families and normality. However, every so often a case arises where a soldier continues the struggle for months or even years after peace is declared. Cut off from their commanders and forgotten by the armies they served, these holdouts often simply did not receive news of their nation's defeat, or refused to believe such information when they did, either convinced that such tales were enemy tricks, or unable to accept the possibility that their side could be defeated, and so closed their eyes to the truth and fought on until they could no longer deny reality. Here are the stories behind 5 soldiers who refused to surrender. Number 5. Amedeo Quiller. Some people just seem destined to lead extraordinary lives, their unique personalities colliding with crucial historical events to leave a legacy that lives on long after they have passed from this world. Yet the 101 years of Amedeo Quiller's life surely rank as some of the most remarkable and varied ever experienced by one man, and would see him fight in 3 wars, lead one of the last cavalry charges in history against modern tanks, artillery and machine guns, before refusing to surrender after his country's defeat, going on to wage his own personal 9-month-long guerrilla war against his enemies, where his courage and tenacity would earn him the nickname Devil Commander and lead to him becoming one of Italy's most decorated soldiers. Born into the Italian aristocracy, the young Amedeo seems set for a comfortable life of high society balls and leisurely pursuits. However, the rise of Mussolini saw his destiny shift dramatically, as the pursuit of an imperial empire to rival that of the Romans became the nation's primary focus, dragging Italy and Quiller into years of war and turmoil that would cement his place in history. Quiller had been picked for the Italian Olympic riding team due to his impressive skills on horseback, and was set to attend the 1936 Games in Berlin. However, Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 put a halt to such ambitions. Using family connections, he obtained a posting as a lieutenant in command of 2,000 African cavalry, which he led with distinction in several engagements against the defending Ethiopians, his exploits catching the attention of his superiors and leading to him being invited to join the Black Flames Division, a group of Italian volunteers who were sent to support Franco in the Spanish Civil War, a vicious conflict between communists and fascists, which resulted in him suffering shrapnel wounds from a grenade blast, and led to him growing disenchanted with Mussolini and his regime, after witnessing the terrible atrocities carried out by German forces on Spanish soil, a nation which was now allied with Italy in a military pact known as the Axis. Depressed by the political direction his homeland and the rest of Europe was taking, Quiller requested a posting to Italian East Africa with the intention of starting a new life in his country's burgeoning empire. However, Mussolini's decision to enter the Second World War on the side of his German allies in June 1940 would once again see him called into action in what was now his 3rd war. With Italy entering the war, her African territories immediately found themselves cut off from home and under attack from hostile forces, their meagre holdings surrounded by the enormous colonies controlled by Britain and France. The Italian forces on the ground faced an uphill battle to hold off their newfound enemies. However, Quiller was undaunted, leading his company of mainly African cavalry led by Italian officers in a series of daring raids and skirmishes as he desperately fought to hold off the British advance into Italian Eritrea, his exploits leading to him being called the Italian Lawrence of Arabia, the Knight from Other Times, and the Devil Commander, as tales of a brave Italian commander leading Eritrean horsemen in battle grew by the day. Yet perhaps his most legendary engagement took place in January 1941, as the British Army was in hot pursuit of the main Italian force which was now in full retreat. In a daring effort to hold off the chasing British and buy the Italians enough time to flee to safety, where perhaps they could regroup and hold off a complete rout of their forces in East Africa, Quiller led hundreds of his horsemen in what would become the last cavalry charge ever faced by the British Army, and one of the last cavalry charges in the history of warfare. With swords drawn, 1,500 men charged head-on into the British camp, cutting their way through the shocked soldiers on the ground as they flanked around the enemy's tanks and armoured cars, tossing grenades as they went, before galloping straight towards the British headquarters and the 25-pound artillery pieces which had previously been targeting Italian fortifications in the distance, but were now quickly retrained to zero elevation to fire on the advancing horsemen. In what must have been sheer panic, the artillery crews hastily opened fire on the marauding cavalrymen, desperate to cut them down before their glistening sabres were close enough to draw blood, Yet despite inflicting terrible casualties on the rapidly advancing enemy, the artillerymen also wreaked havoc amongst their own forces with friendly fire, as the shells which missed the horsemen landed amongst their own comrades, as the cavalry who survived the charge disappeared into the hills. The attack had proved costly for Quiller's men, however the brazen nature of the charge had left the British in disarray and bought the main body of retreating Italians enough time to regroup and occupy a new defensive position, possibly saving thousands of lives in the process and preventing the rest of Italian East Africa from being completely overrun. Despite such heroics, the tide could not be turned, and soon after the British finally broke through and defeated the Italians at Carennes, leaving the Italian general no option but to offer the total surrender of the Italian colonial army in East Africa. Yet thousands of soldiers, including Quiller, refused to surrender with their general, and instead went to ground to begin a guerrilla war in the mountains and deserts of Ethiopia in the hope of tying down as many British soldiers in East Africa as possible, while their German allies continued the fight in North Africa in a determined effort to reverse the earlier Italian disasters. Quiller threw off his uniform, dressed as a native, and took to the mountains and hills to begin his own private campaign against the British, who now occupied the territories that had cost his countrymen so much blood to conquer, leading his Eritrean horsemen in daring raids and ambushes, as over 8 months he unleashed a wave of destruction and chaos, which led to the British placing a bounty of gold on his head, dead or alive. Convoys were attacked and plundered, guard posts were destroyed, trains were derailed, and bridges were blown up as the elusive Quiller evaded his opponents at every turn, his men merely armed with pistols, rifles, and grenades, but using their limited arsenals to deadly effect. The carnage they unleashed forcing the British to dispatch significant military forces from other areas of their African colonies in an attempt to deal with Quiller and the thousands of other rogue Italians still fighting in the former Italian East Africa. Yet despite putting up such fierce resistance, the Axis defeat at the Battle of El Alamein signalled the end of the Italian presence in Africa, and with no hope of turning around the reversal suffered in the early years of the wars, Quiller fled across the Red Sea to neutral Yemen, before finally escaping the clutches of his British pursuers by escaping back to Italy aboard a ship owned by the Red Cross. Still refusing to admit defeat, he immediately requested men, weapons, and supplies from the Italian War Ministry, which he intended to use to stage further guerrilla attacks in Eritrea. However, the Italian government surrendered just days after his return, eventually switching sides and declaring war on their former allies, Germany. Never one for shying away from action, the newly promoted Major Quiller spent the final years of the war with the Military Intelligence Agency, where his former enemies, the British, perhaps recalling his exploits in Africa, assigned him several dangerous missions behind enemy lines, in Italian territories still occupied by the Germans, making him one of the few men to have not only survived 3 wars, but also fought on both sides of the Second World War and lived to tell the tale. Number 4. The German Werewolves. Although the German High Command had signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces on May 7, 1945, a massive explosion at an American military facility in Bremen just a month later resulted in 44 deaths and seemed to confirm the existence of what had earlier just been rumours of an elusive band of fanatical holdouts who had refused to lay down their arms and vowed to continue their doomed struggle operating out of secret hideouts in the forests and mountains of Germany. These elite, die-hard fighters were given the name werewolves, and with as many as 5,000 volunteers drawn from the SS and Hitler Youth, they are believed by some historians to have been responsible for a series of murders and acts of sabotage that claimed as many as 5,500 lives, in a campaign of terror that may have continued until as late as 1950, a full 5 years after the war officially ended. As the Allies closed in from the west following the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944, and the Soviets advanced from the east through Poland with their sights firmly set on Berlin, for all but the most fanatical amongst the German leadership, it was now clear that defeat was inevitable, and Germany would fall in just a matter of months. Under such dire circumstances, contingency plans began to be considered, with some viewing the mountainous areas of southern Germany as the perfect spot from which a small number of committed troops could hold out and keep the ideological flame of National Socialism burning. Yet this plan to relocate the government and army to a fortress in the Alpine mountains was never fully endorsed by Hitler, who viewed such talk as defeatism and even treasonous, and so little serious effort was made to put the plan into motion. However, there were other more developed contingencies for how the Germans might continue the fight after the war had been lost. As 1944 drew to a close, Heinrich Himmler initiated a plan codenamed Operation Werewolf, which called for an elite group of volunteer forces to train in the arts of guerrilla warfare before operating covertly behind enemy lines, drawing weapons and supplies from pre-arranged hidden caches, which they would use to carry out clandestine acts of sabotage, ambush, and assassination that would hamper the Allies' advance in a similar manner to Allied special forces like the Commandos. The Germans had learnt from their experiences with Soviet partisans, and now began teaching the tactics they had witnessed in the East to the as many as 5,000 volunteers drawn from the SS and the Hitler Youth, who were given the name werewolves, and rapidly moulded into experts in the skills of infiltration, sabotage, demolition, and assassination, able to fashion deadly weapons and explosives from common household items to aid in the difficult fight to come. However, it quickly became clear that the idea of moving the German government to a mountain hideout was little more than a delusion, and with it now crystal clear that the war was lost, the werewolves were instead converted into what could be described in modern terms as a terrorist organization, primarily tasked with operating a Nazi underground railroad to help thousands of SS officers escape Germany after the fall of the Third Reich, while simultaneously carrying out acts of destruction, ambush, and assassination of those viewed to be collaborating with the Allies occupying rightful German lands. The campaign of violence they planned to unleash, designed to sabotage rebuilding efforts, destabilize the new German government, and keep alive the memory of the Third Reich in the hope that it might one day rise from the ashes. Rumours of a secretive band of Nazi guerrillas first reached the Allies after the Normandy invasions, with even Time magazine publishing an article which speculated upon the fear that the Germans would try to keep the war going indefinitely by waging a guerrilla campaign from the mountains and forests, and with the infamous werewolf speech given by Goebbels on March 23, 1945, in which he publicised the supposed exploits of the werewolves while urging every German to fight to the death. The advancing Allies began to view every German civilian as a potential werewolf, ready to cut their throat at a moment's notice, causing great confusion over whether attacks suffered in the months and years after the war were down to a coordinated effort by Nazi partisans, or simply solo acts carried out by lone, fanatical SS soldiers. In one incident, a group of 31 men who later confessed to being a werewolf cell were found hiding out in a tunnel network which contained communications equipment, weapons, explosives, and several months' food supplies, along with documents listing prominent US military personnel as targets for assassination, including General Eisenhower, while another raid in March 1946 resulted in the arrest of 80 former German officers who were found to be in possession of a kill list of 400 people targeted for liquidation, along with a sizable cache of ammunition that even contained anti-tank rockets. Despite such efforts to neutralize the werewolf threat, attacks were dangerously common in the months after the war. Several German members of the new post-war government were assassinated, factories, ammunition dumps, and US military facilities were sabotaged or completely destroyed, and tens of millions of dollars of property damage was caused at a time when Germany was desperately trying to rebuild after the devastation of the war. In fact, as many as 5,500 killings have been linked to possible werewolf activity, with the destruction of the US military's government police headquarters in Bremen claiming 44 lives, and 190 Allied soldiers and many more Russian troops murdered during a poison attack in 1946, where alcohol and food supplies likely to be consumed by Allied soldiers were laced with poison by an unknown individual. German civilians believed to be collaborating with the Allies were especially targeted, with red werewolf runes ominously appearing on the doors of collaborators as a warning of the fate that might await them should they continue with their supposed treasonous activity, and many civic leaders shot or hanged, their bodies tagged with warnings to deter others. However, despite such resistance continuing until as late as 1950, the few werewolves who refused to surrender were eventually hunted down and killed or arrested, their efforts to stir up a German uprising deemed minor in the grand scheme of things, the fanatics living in forest huts, standing no chance of reversing the fate of Nazi Germany. Poorly equipped and unable to muster significant support from a war-weary German population, the werewolves failed to achieve their goals, ironically simply serving to harm their own people even more, causing atrocities against German civilians by Allied soldiers, who were fearful of a werewolf presence, and as such handed out collective punishments against locals wherever a suspected werewolf attack occurred, resulting in thousands of Germans dying in the brutal reprisals that followed, with perhaps as many as 80,000 arrested by the Western Allies by 1946, and a further 250,000 people suspected of being subversives, sent to the Siberian gulags by the Soviets, few of whom would ever return home. Yet despite the werewolf cells being officially crushed, some still speculate that perhaps somewhere in the Alpine mountains, a few fanatics still cling to the past to this day. Number 3. The Siege of Baler. In June 1898, 50 Spanish soldiers found themselves holed up in a small church in a remote region of the Philippines, thousands of miles from home and surrounded by hundreds of hostile Filipino revolutionaries who were baying for their blood. Yet despite the war the men were fighting ending just a month into the siege, the stubborn defenders would hold out for an incredible 337 days. Refusing to believe news that Spain had already ceded her colonies to the United States, the once globe-spanning Spanish Empire consigned to the pages of history after more than 4 centuries, these 50 men fighting such a futile defense, becoming known as the last Spaniards in the Philippines, carrying out the empire's last stand long after it had already crumbled. The Philippine revolt against Spanish rule began 2 years earlier in 1896, when after 350 years of domination by outsiders, the people resorted to armed rebellion in an attempt to win their independence once and for all. Yet pitted against a powerful army with access to modern weaponry, the Filipino freedom fighters found it difficult to dislodge the Spanish military presence in their homeland. However, the tide of war was about to change. When the USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, while on a mission to protect US interests during the Cuban revolt against Spanish rule, popular opinion in America quickly laid the blame at the feet of the Spanish, despite the cause of the sinking remaining unclear, even after a Board of Inquiry investigation. Advocates of war with Spain used the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," to stir up public outrage at the killing of 268 of their sailors, and just 2 months later, the Spanish-American War broke out. Backing colonial revolts against Spain, the US wasted no time in seizing Spain's Pacific possessions, and soon became involved in the Philippine Revolution. The rebels unofficially allied themselves with the United States, and aided by the US Navy's decisive defeat of the Spanish Navy at the Battle of Manila Bay, resumed their attacks against the Spaniards, and rapidly gained control of much of the Philippines. It was during the confusion and blurred lines of allegiance of the Spanish-American War and the Philippine Revolution that the curious story of the Siege of Baler would occur. The town had been garrisoned with a small force of 51 Spanish soldiers in an effort to prevent local revolutionaries from receiving smuggled arms. However, with insurrection spreading across the entire country, a force of 800 Filipino rebels descended upon the town to destroy its colonial occupiers. Outnumbered by 16 to 1, the Spanish garrison retreated into the town's church, which was the only sturdy stone building in the area. The rebels responded by surrounding the church with trenches, however they found themselves unable to dislodge the men inside through force alone. They tried to reason with the defenders, leaving warning letters, offering them the chance to leave with their lives, and even trying to smoke them out by setting fires beside the church wall. However, all attempts to break the siege were rebuffed by the stubborn Spaniards inside. Conditions inside the church quickly deteriorated, the men inside spending the humid tropical days confined in a small room with virtually no ventilation, and it wasn't long before their limited food supply began to run out. Yet despite being racked by disease and starvation, the garrison were determined to stand their ground at all costs. The town of Baler was in a remote region only accessible by ship, or on foot through nearly impassable jungle trails that were often washed away by torrential rains. So it's no surprise that the men inside the church did not hear news from their superiors that the war they were fighting so bravely had in fact ended. With the conflict between the US and Spain ending with the Spanish forced to cede their colonial possessions to the US in exchange for a payment of just $20 million, the garrison at Baler should have been relieved of their duty, but cut off from their own government, they fought on in the service of an empire which no longer existed. Unaware that the Filipino rebels were now at peace with Spain, their former enemies laying siege to the church, now fighting a new foreign power in the form of the United States. As the siege dragged on, the Filipinos besieging the church made several attempts to convince the defending Spanish that the war was over, sending them newspapers which reported the end of the war, and even going to the trouble of bringing a uniformed Spanish officer to the town to inform the men that the war was over. However, all such attempts were dismissed by the Spanish commander, who believed that the Filipinos were trying to trick him into surrendering and could not fathom the idea that his beloved Spain had been defeated. The standoff finally came to an end when another newspaper was delivered, which contained a minor article about a close friend of the officer in charge of the garrison. The article listed details regarding the man's relocation to the Spanish city of Malaga, plans which his friend had shared with him privately months earlier, and therefore impossible for the Filipinos to have fabricated. Convinced that the newspaper was genuine, he finally accepted that Spain had lost the war and surrendered after a grueling 337-day-long resistance, 6 months after a peace treaty had already been signed. The president of the First Philippine Republic mercifully allowed the men to return home to Spain, where they were greeted as heroes, declaring that they be considered not as prisoners of war but as friends. Thanks to their admirable commitment to duty, the 30 men still alive from the original 50 who had been present at the siege's beginning, returning to a Spain which had been left in shock, following the sudden and dramatic conclusion of their country's time as a colonial power. Number 2. James Waddell. During an incredible year-long 58,000-mile journey around the globe, which saw 38 enemy merchant ships captured or sunk, the Confederate raiding vessel CSS Shenandoah wreaked havoc upon the United States economy. However, for roughly half their time at sea, the ship's crew were unknowingly fighting for a cause which had already collapsed. Their dreams of an independent Confederacy in the South, long reduced to ashes, and now facing the stark realization that rather than being sailors fulfilling their patriotic duty, for the past 6 months they had in fact been partaking in outright piracy, and would be punished accordingly on their return home, where the hangman's noose was likely to await them. James Waddell was born in 1824 in North Carolina, and began what would become a remarkable career at sea in 1841 when he joined the United States Navy as a midshipman, going on to see action in the Mexican-American War of 1846, before finally resigning his commission in 1861 when the American Civil War broke out. He returned home to take up a position in the newly formed Confederate States Navy, where he was given command of the CSS Shenandoah in 1864 and dispatched on a mission to seek out and utterly destroy Union commerce on the high seas. Over the course of 12 months, the Shenandoah and her crew terrorized US merchant vessels around the world, from the South Atlantic to as far afield as the Indian Ocean and Arctic, where they carried out their mission to disrupt the Union's economy by raiding her trading vessels with a ruthless efficiency, capturing or sinking 38 ships worth tens of millions of dollars, taking over 1,000 prisoners, and carrying the Confederate flag around the globe, becoming the first and only Confederate vessel to circumnavigate the planet, all without losing a single casualty in combat. However, in the midst of such success, the crew were unaware that for roughly half their time at sea, the war they were fighting so effectively had already been lost. Over a month after General Robert E. Lee had surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia, the Shenandoah captured a Union ship, which contained a newspaper reporting the end of the war. However, crucially, the article in question also contained Confederate President Jefferson Davis's proclamation that the war would be carried on with renewed vigor, a statement which the dedicated captain took to heart, refusing to believe that the Confederate cause was lost, continuing his mission with an even greater zeal, going on to capture 10 more Union whaling ships in just 7 hours as he resolved to carry on the fight. Yet the cold hard truth could only be ignored for so long, and after an encounter with a British ship on the high seas, the captain finally heard news from a neutral source of the Confederate surrender, along with the capture of the Confederate president. Captain Waddell now knew with certainty that the war was over, along with his mission, yet the crew could not simply sail home and carry on with their normal lives. On board a ship without a country, the crew of the Shenandoah faced the horrifying reality that in the eyes of US authorities, they were all pirates, as their raids on commercial shipping for the best part of the last 6 months were carried out during peacetime, and therefore little more than theft and plunder, according to the laws of the day. Surrendering at the nearest US port would land them in front of a hostile court, and the recent assassination of President Lincoln meant that there would likely be little leniency shown for a band of Confederate outlaws, with their most likely fate being at the end of a hangman's noose. The captain refused to accept such a grim end, and quickly hatched a plan that would see him and his crew to safety. He began what would become a 130-day voyage to the English port of Liverpool, a city which had deep ties with the now vanquished Confederate states, and a place where he was confident he would receive a warm welcome. Yet the journey was fraught with risk, as US warships were actively hunting the rogue raider which had caused so much damage, and so in order to evade detection, he dismounted the vessel's guns and painted her hull black to disguise her as an ordinary merchant vessel, sailing to England on a route that avoided land and busy shipping routes where vigilant eyes might notice their passing. On November 6, 1865, the Shenandoah finally arrived at Liverpool and surrendered to authorities, her crew officially becoming the last of the Confederate rebels to surrender over 6 months after the Civil War had ended, the men finally returning home to the US in 1867 under a general amnesty, where, depending on whom you asked, they were either pirates and traitors who escaped justice, or brave patriots who did their duty. Number 1. Hero Onoda. Although the Second World War officially ended in 1945, thousands of Japanese soldiers scattered across Asia found themselves stranded and isolated in foreign lands as the Japanese war machine ground to a halt, the lost men either failing to receive orders notifying them of the surrender, hearing the news but believing it to be false Allied propaganda, or so fanatical to their cause and devoted to the Emperor whom they saw as a god on earth that they simply refused to surrender, vowing to fight on in the jungles of occupied territories until the bitter end. Yet one Japanese officer would take devotion to duty to a whole other level, obeying the last order he received to never surrender by continuing to fight the Second World War for an additional 30 years until he was finally persuaded to emerge from the jungle like a ghost from another era, the incredible tale of one of the war's last holdouts, exemplifying the extraordinary discipline and obedience of the Japanese Imperial Army. Hiro Onoda was born in 1922 into a family with a proud and ancient samurai tradition, his father a cavalry sergeant who would later be killed in action in China in 1943. So it's no surprise that as soon as he turned 18, Onoda joined the Imperial Japanese Army Infantry. In 1944, the young lieutenant was dispatched to the Japanese-occupied Philippine island of Lubang with orders to destroy the airstrip and harbour installations in an effort to hamper a looming American invasion of the island, as the US military was fast approaching, having returned to liberate the Philippines nearly 3 years after the islands had fallen to the Japanese. Across Asia, territories conquered by Japan just a few short years before were falling like dominoes as the Allied advance increased in pace towards its ultimate target, Japan itself. The soldiers stationed at outposts still under the Imperial Army's control held their breath and prepared for an inevitable final showdown with their bitter foes. It was against this grim backdrop that Onoda arrived at Lubang, where he joined up with the beleaguered Japanese forces already stationed on the island. However, outranked by the officer in command, his plans for sabotage were superseded by new orders, and he found himself instead enlisted to help prepare a total evacuation of all Japanese troops. The American hammer blow came crashing down on February 28, 1945, when US and Philippine forces landed on the island's beaches, storming forwards and conquering the entire island in brutal fighting that saw most of Onoda's remaining comrades killed or captured. As the island fell, the Japanese major in charge issued Onoda his final, fateful orders. He was to stand and fight to the end, without surrendering or taking his own life, continuing the fight against the Allies until the Imperial Army returned, no matter how long that might take. Little did Onoda know that 3 decades of struggle in the island's thick jungles lay ahead of him. With the complete Japanese surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the tragedy of the Second World War had finally come to an end. However, for thousands of isolated Japanese soldiers spread across Southeast Asia, China, and the thousands of small islands of the Pacific, nothing had changed, and the war was still very much on. These stragglers found themselves cut off from their army's command structure, and therefore still very much bound to whatever the last orders were, which frequently were to simply carry on the fight until they heard otherwise. Allied forces began the arduous task of locating and mopping up these lingering centres of resistance, and in the weeks and months after the armistice, thousands were captured, killed, or starved to death, having gone into hiding in the jungles and forests in a futile attempt to continue their struggle, with many who did hear news of Japan's surrender dismissing it as nothing more than propaganda and deception. With the fall of Lubang in 1945, Onoda and 3 other soldiers stayed true to the final orders they had received, fleeing into the jungle to begin what would become a 30-year guerrilla war. The 4 men lived in makeshift bamboo huts, stealing food from villagers and scavenging whatever nutrition they could find in the island's dense jungles, perpetually tormented by the sweltering tropical heat and swarms of mosquitoes that feasted on any piece of exposed skin, while constantly living under the threat of discovery, frequently involved in shootouts with local police and villagers in which they are said to have killed as many as 30 people. Yet despite such hardships, the men managed to stay in relatively good health, keeping their uniforms and weapons in perfect working order, despite access to limited supplies. However, their stay on the island was not without a price. Unable to bear the Spartan life they were leading, one of Onoda's companions cracked and surrendered to Philippine forces in 1950, and by 1972 his remaining 2 companions had been killed by encounters with Philippine army and police patrols. After 27 years of struggle, Onoda was now on his own, yet the bedraggled soldier still refused to give up. After 2 more years alone in the jungle, Onoda encountered a fellow Japanese citizen named Norio Suzuki, who had ventured into the island's jungles on a mission to locate the long-lost soldier and bring him home. However, despite being assured that the war was long over, Onoda refused to surrender until he received orders to do so from a superior officer. Not one to give up, Suzuki returned to Japan with photos of himself and Onoda together in the jungle as proof of their encounter, prompting the Japanese government to track down Onoda's former commanding officer before flying him to Lubang, where on March 9, 1974, he formally relieved Onoda from his burden of duty and ordered him to surrender to authorities 30 long years after he had first fled into the island's interior. Onoda handed over his sword and rifle to the Philippine president, who issued a formal pardon to the long-lost soldier, as despite taking the lives of up to 30 people, the fact that he believed he was still at war was deemed to be justification for the killings, and he was allowed to return home to Japan, where he received nothing short of a hero's welcome, the population intoxicated by the incredible tale of a man who embodied a devotion to traditional values that was thought to have been extinct in Japan's modernized society. Unsurprisingly, Onoda struggled to fit in with this new and bustling alien world of skyscrapers, television, and automobiles, and he soon left for a small Japanese colony in Brazil, where he led a solitary life raising cattle before finally settling again in Japan in 1984. His amazing story persisting as an example of defiance against the odds, while continuing to encourage the imagination with thoughts that perhaps somewhere out there in the wilderness, other holdouts from the war continue to do their duty. So those are my choices for 5 soldiers who refused to surrender. Leave a comment below with other interesting examples you know about, and I'll see you again soon.